is Kim Fortun, and I'm a professor and department chair in the Department of Anthropology, University of California, Irvine. STS is many things. It's an empirical area of work where we try to understand the role of science, technology, technical infrastructure, and knowledge forms in the constitution of sociocultural phenomena. But I think more importantly, it's a space for a certain kind of scholarship that constantly questions epistemic authority, how epistemic authority is created in different settings, the impacts it has, what epistemic authority we have and should try to have as anthropologists and social scientists. I think STS is enriched by the diversity of frameworks, ethical, political, methodological, that are in the field. And myself, I came in some ways from a different place than many scholars. I came into STS from the post-colonial literature and the critiques of Enlightenment reason, the critiques of universalism. And also empirically. I worked in my dissertation research on material that took science into the courtroom, and so the questions of epistemic authority, who has it, who gets left out of authoritative accounts, was there early on. And then I got hired in an STS department immediately after my PhD, so I grew into an STS scholar as a teacher in part, and by being around STS scholars. And I must say, particularly historians of science have had a strong influence on my thinking, because the way that what counts as robust knowledge, what counts as usable knowledge, changes in different historical times and different settings is a core theme of my work and a continuing interest. So I study the environmental health sciences, and so I study interdisciplinary projects, and they are a great source of inspiration to me. I'm impressed by the way people in the environmental health sciences have worked together on longitudinal studies, returned to studies, reanalyzed data, taken studies from one location to another. And I've also seen the way that data sharing in those fields has animated new methods and theories in those fields. So the interdisciplinarity I study has animated my own interdisciplinary practice. I'm interested in working with the environmental health scientists, and they often see us as a way to understand the larger field in which they're operating. Pollution scientists, for example, often say that they never meet the health scientists, and so they use our research to understand how those research communities are approaching an issue of shared concern. But I also, importantly, have come to collaborate in building research infrastructure to support collaboration among social scientists, particularly in anthropology and STS. And that's involved extended collaboration with people in data science and computer science to understand what kind of digital infrastructure we need, how digital infrastructure is deeply encoded with epistemological assumptions, how it can be designed to support different kinds of assumptions, and particularly those that I bring to my work. Post-structuralism has been a guiding body of work for me, and so we've worked hard to understand what it means to build post-structural understandings of language and meaning production into a digital system. Translating that to our computer science colleagues has been challenging and interesting, but that effort to build infrastructural capacity for our own field continues to be an interdisciplinary collaboration, because we're dependent on technologists to build that infrastructure. I think a really vernacular understanding of how meaning is made is when it's robust knowledge, when it settles down, when there's consensus around it. And the way that meaning can have great nuance and efficacy when it's very labile and flexible and has a lot of dimensionality. And so post-structural understandings of the way that meaning doesn't settle down, or it only settles down with a certain kind of violence, is core to my methodological practice. And I'm interested in observing how those kinds of assumptions about meaning and knowledge are in the practice of the scientists that I study. When I started my research career, I worked in India at the site of a multinational corporate disaster that injured many, many thousands of people. At the time, I didn't think of myself as an environmental studies scholar or as a disaster studies scholar, because there really wasn't a community of practice around that. Environmental studies was more focused on natural resource management. I slowly became a globalization scholar, but that was just emerging. The international free trade agreements were being signed. I was sort of an anthropologist of law, but the anthropology of globalization was growing. Over time, I became increasingly an anthropologist of science, because my work on the Bhopal disaster was partly about the way claims about the injuries in Bhopal appeared before the courts. So I was interested in what kinds of scientific claims are legible in the court system. And that got me very interested in where do those claims come from and what counts, who makes environmental health knowledge, how does it move in our society. And so the anthropology of science really emerged in sync with my career. Beginning around the 90s, the anthropology of science really blossomed. And importantly, it's been a really vital area of methodological innovation for anthropology. And I think simply because you can't study scientists you can't simply transfer the methods of anthropology as usual to studies of the sciences. So it's been kind of methodologically vital. So the anthropology of science, around Hurricane Katrina, 2005, disaster became a rubric for organizing research, but also a lot of human services. The UN had a year of the disaster, which is actually more natural disaster focused. Hurricane Katrina brought disaster into public visibility. And for the first time, I was asked to teach courses as a visiting scholar in disaster studies. And so it is, and of course, in some ways, I was the old woman of disaster studies, but I had never thought of myself in those terms. And so as a result, for example, I worked on the Fukushima disaster as someone who brought understanding of other disasters to that community of researchers. So again, I became a disaster researcher because of the scholarly context and political context around me. More recently, the investment in open access, open data, digital infrastructure has been a core theme of my work, and it's certainly there is a flood of activity and a sense that this is a really urgent area of scholarly concern, because it really is the infrastructure within which we make our scholarship. And so I think in STS has a lot to bring to that area of work, and we need to be providing a leadership role. So scholarly infrastructure itself, infrastructure studies, of course, has also become a big field just in the last few years. So it's exciting the way that the nexus of anthropology and STS has constantly created these new areas of concern that's developed very rich bodies of work around them. Another example is toxics, and particularly gender and toxics. Barely a community of practice just a few years ago, and now there's a rich body of work. So I've been asked about kind of emerging areas of work that I think have a spark to them. And I think one of them is the nexus of information and data studies and politics, but environmental studies in particular. And I'll give this example. I've taught in environmental studies for many, many years. Never is there even a chapter on data politics as constitutive of environmental politics. It's just not in the mix. But increasingly you see people documenting and analyzing the way the availability, visualization, and circulation of data is constitutive of what counts as an environmental problem and how we respond to it. And so I think it's been long underattended to, and now there's a flourishing body of work. The EDGI group, the Environmental Data Governance Initiative, which emerged in response to the Trump administration in the US, to steward environmental data in a period when the government was disappearing that data, has been a really, really inspiring example of how STS scholarship can move into practice on very, very quickly, mobilize and have organizational effectiveness impressively quickly. So where is STS headed? I think there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of exciting areas. I'm particularly impressed by the intensification of collaboration among STS scholars so that you can just get at more dimensionality in the engagement with any phenomena. There's a real interest in the movement of STS into practice. Younger scholars in particular have approached me to ask about how the Society for Social Studies of Science in particular can bolster people moving from academic positions into practice, and what does it mean to skill up for that movement. And importantly, I don't think that it's being imagined as a stepping down from intellectual life, but really a creative movement of intellectual life into different spaces. So it's intellectually demanding to think about what that looks like. So the STS in practice, and also the investment in the questions of the university and the conditions of our own production. And so there's an emerging discussion among STS scholars distributed around the world about our varied conditions of productions, how we could share infrastructure and thus scaffold each other, learn from each other. And I think there's going to be I'm hopeful that there is going to be a lot of dynamism coming from that transnational collaboration in coming years. And the most concrete and fun example that comes to mind is that for many years I ran a program where I had our students design critical environmental education for very young children, but also importantly, teaching young children to be researchers. And what I learned is that it's actually a fabulous way to teach undergraduates how to think about how other people think, how to think about why they may not be able to hear what you're telling them, about what the kind of language games are. But importantly, it also in process made the students involved in it stewards of the education of others. And so they grew into a role as citizens really through their involvement in designing education for others. So that's been a really rewarding example. I've done that for about 5 years in my previous job in upstate New York at RPI. We ran it both for like 6 to 10-year-olds, but we also ran a research program where for 9 weeks 13 to 16-year-olds learned to do extended research projects. I also learned that a great way to teach an undergraduate how to do research is to charge them to teach a younger student how to do research. So that kind of movement into education, and I've long been committed and inspired by the radical education literature and movement. And so the promise of education as political mobilization is very core to the way I think about my work as a scholar. And so that movement into younger students' education has been critical. The other example I'll give about moving STS into the world is, again, building infrastructure that helps us garner credibility and visibility for the kind of knowledge that social scientists create. And I think that we've we have work to do building that visibility. Before we can go public, we need to build the infrastructure to be ready to do so. And so in some ways the digital infrastructure work I've done is a precursor to work in the public sphere. You know, in the US, there's a lot of concern that we're producing too many PhDs because there's a lot of jobs. As someone who studies system failures, disasters, and systems breaking down, I want more expertise in our society and more people paying attention to society's problems. So I think the more education in our societies, the better. We need to find ways for people to make a living wage being intellectuals, but finding ways to move people with training as intellectuals, thinking of themselves as intellectuals, moving into jobs of responsibility in government, in the education system at all levels, in NGOs, and even in the business sector. I think that there's challenging work to be done imagining what a civic-oriented commercial sector would look like. So I think we need STS scholars everywhere.